Welcome to the Lean by Design podcast, the show that explores the relationship between people and workflow design within the life sciences industry. I'm your host, Lawrence Wong, and my co-host is Oscar Gonzalez. Join us as our guests tell inspiring stories that have shaped their careers and deliver tips to help you work smarter and become lean by design.
Welcome back to another episode of Lean by Design podcast. I'm your host, Oscar Gonzalez, alongside my co-host, friend, business partner, Lawrence Wong. And today we are excited to have Dan Luu come into the studio with us today to really talk about how we can take simple processes that are common within life sciences and start to think about automations and things like that. So, Dan, feel free, go ahead and say hello to all of our listeners.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dan. I've been in the life sciences now for 8 years, going on 8 years plus, and I've worked at a variety of biotechs in California and out here in the Boston area where I'm kind of currently based now. And I work as mainly right now as a data engineer, helping biotechs automate their workflows and their pipelines related to machine learning and whatever else tooling that they need developed.
So interesting. You did not start with data engineering, software engineering. You originally started in the lab doing research in stem cells, to be more specific. So can you kind of talk about where did that start? Where did that desire to work on the bench, where did that come from?
Yeah, so my specialty is actually really in the neurosciences, and I've always been fascinated by the brain from a very young age. And when I decided to go to college, I majored in biology with a focus on what would now be considered a neuroscience major, but we didn't have that then. And I first moved out to the San Francisco Bay Area to work at this startup. And we were producing neurostem cells, and we were selling them as a product, as well as developing different types of stem cell lines. So I got my start in the neurosciences pretty early, and even in college, I did undergraduate research. And then after the startup at working with stem cells, I kind of transitioned and worked more directly on Alzheimer's research at a company called Alkahest, and they were mostly a plasma-based company. And I did a lot of imaging and a lot of cell culture work there too, but mostly on primary culture. So a lot of lab work. But what kind of transitioned me into the realm of data engineering, data science, was really during this time period, I realized that I was repeating a lot of the assays that I had, that when you do a physical experiment, you kind of understand that you have to repeat it. But in terms of the analysis part and everything that comes after when the experiment is done, that can be automated. And at the time, I really was looking for ways to automate certain assays, certain products, or not really products, but just experiments that we would be repeating. And we developed, my main position was standard assay development. So we were just developing assays for screening or for mechanistic testing or anything like that. And once we developed these assays, we would kind of just repeat them, but we never really automated them. I was kind of like one of the first ones to automate some of our image analysis tools. We would take multiple images of immunofluorescent chemistry neurons, and we would run analysis on them. And that's kind of where I first got my foot into realizing that, this automating step is actually really fun for me. I kind of want to do it. So explore it further. And so I left the company and I focused mostly on teaching myself how to code, doing a boot camp, and kind of upskilling myself and transitioning to the computational side. And after that, I was working at another startup back here. I moved back to the Boston area and started another startup, Javelin, where I was a data scientist, and I was actually it was really nice because it was a smaller startup, and I got to be one of the leads in controls in developing our whole data infrastructure. So where, we can standardize and the way everything that happens in the lab, and then whatever happens in the lab goes through a standardized process, and it goes to an automated workflow, and we can train machine learning models on stuff like that, and kind of just moved on from there. And then now I'm mostly at a consulting company now called Arreo, and I get contracted out as a data engineer, and I help other biotechs now. I've been working with a few clients where I just automate kind of their processes and see what the best method is, evaluate kind of their issues, and we just continue working from there. And I haven't looked back, and everything has been very, very fun so far.
Isn't that what happens once you kind of find a little bit of a niche that you really enjoy? It's almost like I can't turn away from ever. This is how I look at the problem, and I'm acknowledging that, and this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. That's awesome. I've been there.
Yeah, totally. I actually more so enjoy the data science side of things, but I actually really enjoy the infrastructure side of things as well. So I mostly primarily help clients with on infrastructure projects so that their data scientists or machine learning engineers or even wet lab scientists can go in and use a centralized system, whatever that may be, and kind of all be on the same page, so nothing gets really lost between teams and between the company, so the company can kind of see this where all their data is coming in and make inference or analysis or machine learning or do whatever they want towards it. And building that infrastructure has been like pretty crucial, because without it, everyone would trying to be doing their own thing, and then there's just a lot of disconnect between different team members, different bosses, different directors, and it gets a little bit messy. So yeah, this infrastructure work is like super vital. And if I ever want to do something, go to another startup or whatever, I would have all the tools ready to build up my own infrastructure project on another scale.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So Dan, I was going to ask, so it sounds like you spent a lot of time doing manual work, and then that kind of grew your appreciation for, I guess, organizing data and maybe analyzing it, and then that kind of led to you becoming a data engineer. For people that are not familiar with the differences between data science versus data engineering, could you kind of explain like what that is?
Yeah, for sure. It's a vastly growing field. Data science, I think, has been thrown around a lot, but data engineering is kind of a new and upcoming field, especially in the life sciences and even in the tech industry as well. So data science is really about working with data, analyzing data, and doing some kind of analysis on that data, and potentially even usually building machine learning models out of it, and just having some kind of inferences and using that power of the data. The data engineer is building all the infrastructure tools so that the data to support the data scientists. So you have to get that data somewhere, right? So in the very break of the industry, maybe like, I don't know, eight years ago or even less than that, data scientists kind of had the same hat as a data engineer, because it was a very new field where you just have all this data coming in and you have no way to organize it in a standardized way. So the data engineer kind of automates all this data so that the data scientist can use it, either through automating like experiments where all this data comes in and organizing in a way so that so the data scientist can easily access the data and use that data immediately. Or in terms of deploying machine learning models, say a data scientist has built a machine learning model and we want to use that model as a product. So the data engineer will go and step in and take whatever machine learning model that the data scientist has developed, and then take that model and take it to what we call production, where that stakeholders and clients outside the company would use it, and or even internally for other scientists along the teams to use this machine learning model. So the data engineer is kind of like he's the person who just builds the infrastructure that so that everyone else, and the foundation where everyone else can kind of use the space, that the data space, really.
Right. So for like a lack of a better word, it sounds like it's like a matchmaker essentially. Like you're taking the requirements from the scientist, and you have these like data scientists who are trying to build this model, and you're kind of in between trying to understand what the requirements are, and you're kind of enabling that flow of information to go from one to the other, right?
Yeah. I think the flow of information thing is the most critical thing. Data engineers make the flow of information between stakeholders, team members, coworkers, whatever, very easy. So that's like their main thing that they do, but which requires a lot of work, because it also involves like cloud work, working with Amazon, AWS, and getting cloud services on, especially if data scientists have needs of really powerful machine learning computation that they need to do to run, and the data engineer will help them set that up. So some scientists, data scientists, can also be data engineers. And when I first started, I kind of did everything. It was a life cycle of, I would be developing a new model, and then I would be talking to my manager and talking about how we're going to turn this into a productionized model or a dashboard or something, so that we can have other people in our company use this model. So I would be spending, like, I would say, I don't know, it would be a life cycle of develop the model or clean the data, build up the database and whatnot, and then work on those models, and then turn that model into something useful so that other people can use it. So it's just the cyclical thing. But at larger companies, they separate those two tasks out. So yeah.
So, one of the things that I'm familiar with, and I want to get your take on, is the importance of how you connect with the scientists in order to build a system that is not only coming from an engineering space, but also really built for purpose and built for the needs of that organization. I've seen time and time again where there are internal systems built that are supposed to be collecting your data and transforming them, but they're not coming from someone that has had that wet lab experience, or that experience to understand, what does the data even look like? What would it represent, and how would somebody use it? How important is your background to you in the wet lab, uh, in terms of how it helps you think about the problems and how to solve them? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's actually an amazing question. There's so many avenues this can kind of go down on, but it's having the wet lab experience makes you kind of understand the experiences from the wet lab side, so that you can make better tools, or you can understand what the wet lab scientists really need. And part of it is just really convincing. Part of it is convincing the wet lab scientists that, this automation is needed. And part of it is showing them how much easier life could be if you just do XYZ instead of relying on whatever traditional methods you learned or you're using. And the data itself is so unique, depending where you're working on in the wet lab. So like someone who's in a vivarium or in doing live animal work,
Right.
You have to think about, so they're like computational scientists who have no wet lab experience, and think that, this person in the lab doing these mice experiments can come in at 12 a.m. and do a recording or whatever. And it's not very feasible. Or you're setting up some kind of system where data is constantly coming in. As like a data engineer or someone organizing that data, you maybe not want to put all of the data in immediately because it needs to be cleaned, or there's kind of a delay where you want to wait maybe after a whole week of data is accumulated and changed, and then that gets pushed in. So you have to understand really the type of experiments that are coming down between the wet lab scientists and what is more downstream of that in terms of how it's being analyzed. So, transcriptomics is a whole different side of things in terms of informatics. Those data sets are very massive. And then you have smaller assays like an ELISA or some basic behavioral assay, or just
Where your
just
data
something
point
relatively
is
simple.
right, where your data point is
Yeah,
really just a single point. Where when you're doing transcriptomics, usually you're looking at reads across some genomic signature, so you're seeing multiple data points for every single sample rather than one data point per sample.
exactly.
Yep.
And understanding that is pretty important in itself. And I'm fortunate enough that my wet lab experience has exposed me to a lot of different methods and assays, at least within the in vitro world, and a lot of molecular biology. I got to play with a lot of those assays, and it's been a while for me now, so I it feels weird to think about it, and I just kind of forget it all. But when someone mentions this, it kind of brings back flashbacks, like, oh, I remember doing this exact experiment. And I know that, okay, if you're reading a plate or whatever, you're going to get an Excel format out, and then how can we minimize whatever minimize the work that the wet lab person has to do, so that we can put it into some kind of central database or some kind of central area where it's easily accessed, and it's going to be the analysis is going to be easily automated. So it's very important, I think. And even when you talk to designing the infrastructure, and you talk to these wet lab scientists, you want to see their input and hear their input on how they want to do some things. If they know that they're being if they're being bogged down, or
So you're looking
I
for
forget
pain
the
points.
term.
You're looking for pain
Yeah,
points.
you're looking for the pain points. They know where they're slowing down for whatever, and that this is where we can go in and really ease those pain points and make things more efficient.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Thank you to our sponsor, Perna Communications, a Boston-based digital communications firm for life sciences, healthcare, and mental health companies. Life science companies have an important story, but it's not always easy with the industry jargon. Lauren and her team turn your technical talk into compelling content that feels authentic to your brand and resonates with your audience. If you need help with your digital content or copywriting, visit laurenperna.com to learn more about how they can tell your company's story. It's funny because I tell people all the time, when you ask the right questions, there's nothing more that a person would love to tell you about than the things that they don't like about their work. And in what we do, and I'll just say us as having worked in the lab, we are not fans of mundane tasks that, you sit back and you think, there's got to be a better way. Like, is this really how we want to spend our time to process this information over and over and over again? And I've seen people actually just with Excel creating macros to, quick, and that's a simple solution. If for some reason your system is only spitting out Excel, but you have this consistent, processing of, making a pivot table, then doing, XYZ process. I've seen people doing those macros, and I understand that, with what you're presenting with us today is far more complex than a simple pivot table. So I guess, can you talk about your early on when you decided to kind of take the reins on bringing automation into your group? What were those pain points like for you, and how did that make you feel when you joined the company and you saw a need? How did that make you feel?
Is this for when I was still in the wet lab, or after I transitioned?
Yeah, I'm curious to understand, how deep was that burning you that really put you into transition of, I'm going to actually change what I'm doing because this is a need that needs to be filled. Like, what did it feel like when you were in the wet lab and not having the automation that just kind of came to you?
Yeah, so there were multiple instances. So I think our company at the time, my last wet lab company experience, I guess, they were pushing towards automation for a lot of different assays, but because there's so many different groups, some got more prioritized than others.
Sure.
And being in vitro, you're kind of less prioritized. So I kind of had to take the reins on myself. So I was able to kind of save somewhat of like a analysis profile that I would just modify each time and go over certain, just kind of run through the profile, like just go over the template to see if the whatever this masking algorithm I did would fit in, and then just slightly modify it. So that's where I kind of first started with the automation, in terms of just the analysis. But then you have like the downstream analysis, the statistic part, where you're looking for significance between if your drug had a treatment or you didn't have a treatment. And what I kind of did there, that was very painful because it was just a lot of copying pasting between Excel to Prism, which is our statistical analysis tool, and then from Prism you generate a graph, and then from that graph you kind of just make a PowerPoint. And this is kind of what I talked about in my article that I recently wrote, is once you kind of just develop this standard assay, there's always there's a way to automate it so everything becomes a lot faster. So my complaints were never really about repeating the experiment multiple times, because I know that's that's necessary.
Yeah.
But the downstream things, once that's done, like I should be able to just, run the analysis tool and then just spit it, then just have the analysis kick off, and then spit out the statistical results, and then see, and then summary data. Then you have to summarize all these experiments. So like you look at the data within an experiment, and then you look at the summary of all the experiments that you repeated to look for significance. And I felt like this all could be very easily automated. I just at the time didn't really know what the best way to do it was. And to your point with Excel and Prism itself, they're very powerful tools.
Right.
But when you rely on them to do purely to automate your whole workflow, that's where it becomes a little annoying. And that's kind of not what that's not where they excel at, because there's so many other tools out there that you can build or bootstrap from that just make this whole process just much faster. And especially for using, like say after even I finish a report or whatever, I present the report, and then this report now kind of just lives on some file on the company server, in a
SharePoint, probably.
or SharePoint that you don't really go back to it unless it's like really powerful data. And then, in terms of data adherence or data integrity and just like data governance, in terms of all those things, it's kind of hard to keep track of like how your experiments have been changing over time, and how the assay has maybe slightly changed, maybe not.
Yes.
It's like documentation control is like becomes very important. And when you just keep your data in these your summarized data in these PowerPoints that kind of get lost after a few years, and then I'm gone, and probably no one looks at them now, really.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's a common, it's a common feature that I've seen, that you get the data and you summarize it, and it becomes an image into a PowerPoint slide that it's presented during a team meeting. And then the minute that you want to understand the data, you get folks that are saying, well, the data is in this database system, whatever database system you have. Well, that's the raw data, but the analysis part, that has been done by someone and it lives somewhere. So how, there goes the question, how do we organize this summary data so that when we say, okay, let's go back and look at the project, we can easily understand the purpose of those experiments and what the result was, rather than saying, okay, well, let's now go back into the slide deck and try to find, over the course of 9 months of meetings, let's try to find the slides that represent that, because we don't remember which experiment it was. And I will say from experience, that is a very, very, very common occurrence of having summarized data within a PowerPoint slide and not really anywhere else. And it really just, it slows things down. It slows things down just to understand, what did we already do?
Right. I've also seen and heard from multiple accounts where there have been experiments and studies that actually have been repeated across different teams because there was no cross connect collaboration
Yes.
where some group decides to do one thing and then another group within the same company decides also to do the same thing but in a slightly different way, but there's no connect. And then now you just have two groups who just ran the same study or experiment, and you kind of lost some time there. But
Not to
hey,
mention
you
they
got
probably had two different protocols.
yeah, yeah. So and then it's like hard to compare between, like, you would say that, oh well, at least we have, at least two studies, two experiments to look at, but you know how are we going, like, can we really compare them as apples to
Yeah,
apples
it's
if
not an N of
there is no
two. It's
process
like an N of
used to
1.1 and
one?
an N of, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there was like a tremendous value in what you did early on for automating that particular process that you talked about. I mean, do you ever wonder like why people didn't automate it before you came along to work on that process? And like, if you're having so much trouble, I would assume that other people are also experiencing some of the same pain
Yep.
points. And like, why do you think people don't, point that out or maybe try to fix it themselves? Like, what's the thing that holds them back?
Yeah, so there was actually one assay that was a very big pain point that we had that actually did get automated, but it was automated for the in vivo people because our in vitro data was slightly different. Like, you're working with cell data, and then in vivo people are working with like live animal data. So, and that assay was like a QT PCR data, and it just requires the assay itself. When you run a qt-pcr, it's just a lot of work, and then you get the output, and then you have to normalize the controls, you have to do all this and that. And the people on the informatics team was able to allocate resources for someone to come in and make an application that automates that assay, in terms of you run the assay and you get an output, and you get your pretty much your analyzed data, and then from there you still have to make your graphs and stuff, but the analysis part was done and it was automated. So that kind of happened. But to your original point as to like why no one really does it, is I think one is just education, especially in the biotechs. I feel that we don't get things move very slow, especially if you come from like a traditional academic background. In certain educational systems, like academic labs across the nation, it's not all really standardized. Everyone kind of does their own different thing. And then in all these labs, when you get trained, they're using like archaic systems. You learn how to use Excel in school and stuff, but you don't really get trained on like, oh, how do we automate things? That's kind of stuff that's been at the forefront of kind of this last 2 decades, I would guess, within the tech industry, where you know the Facebooks, the Netflixes, and whatnot, and the Googles, they learn to automate these things, and they build the software has accelerated at a rapid pace. But in terms of bleeding over into the life sciences space, that hasn't really been there. So that's why people don't really think about it too deeply, because they don't really know any better. And I think now, at least within the last maybe like 3 years, I've seen in the life sciences industry, where all these biotechs now, especially after the pandemic, and how Moderna was able to utilize all of their data tools and
Yep.
whatnot to put out a drug in I don't know, 8 or 9 months, is insane. And now all these biotechs are kind of realizing what we kind of really need to do, and they're modernizing all of their systems, and they're changing, and it's for the better now. But to your original point, like, why hasn't this been done before? Because we didn't really know any better. And it's one, we didn't really know any better. Two, people don't really like change in general. And I would say three is just it requires extra resources, and it can't, it's sometimes, depending on the assay, it could be very simple, as like Oscar said before, with just like an Excel macro or whatever macro, and then, or you could have it be very complex where you need a full-time person developed that's on these projects developing these tools to automate these assays. Yeah.
It's funny because I think some of what you're describing is, when you're coming up through academia, through science, you are being brought into the industry for your expertise, for your knowledge of science, for the depth of knowledge that you have. And we tend to stay in that lane, and in a similar stride of how I transitioned from the wet lab into project management, now consulting. It was that same sort of, well, this is what we do and this is what you do and this is where we stay in our lane. That is done by the engineers or by IT. And so it kind of automatically just says, like, yeah, if you want to try to build anything new, you just have to go over there and go to them, rather than, hey, let me take a stab at what I can do to make my process a little bit easier. There's a saying that is, lazy people are geniuses, and it's because we're trying to find ways to be uh, optimizing the time that we have, so that I don't have to spend any more time on something than I actually need to. If I can find a way to do this quickly, then I get much more of my time back to creatively think about my next experiment, my next solution, etc. So I completely am on board with you on those points for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's like a cultural thing. I think, when you have a smaller company that may be more open to having some of these like quick changes where you can automate things quickly, but
Yep.
if you're working at like a giant company, that may be less likely to happen because it just, I don't know how many hoops you have to jump through to get something done. But to that point, do you, I'm going to swing back to the other side of it and say, just because you can automate something doesn't mean you should automate it. And so, we all know that we have, a finite amount of like time, money, resources. So, as a consultant, how do you deal with constraints when you talk to your, customers as scientists and data scientists?
I think the biggest constraints are in terms of like priority, right? Coming back to my last wet lab experience where we had one assay become automated, and it was because everyone needed that assay. It was the biggest pain point and it was the biggest roadblocker for a lot of people. So they finally put in resources to do it. And the like when I talk to data scientists and other people on the computational side about, constraints, is really what are we prioritizing here and what needs the most attention, and that's where we're going to really focus our time the most. That's like the best way to do it, because you don't have you got to learn to prioritize your projects. Otherwise, like if it's something that doesn't really take long to just copy and paste, there's really no reason to automate it. And then in the same vein is, when people are developing assays and running experiments, they don't know what the outcome is going to be. There's no point in automating that process either. But in terms of analysis tools and experiments that already have been run by like companies and labs across the world multiple different times, it's something that's used everywhere, then there should already probably be some way to automate that. And the surprising thing is that there's really not. So like an ELISA assay is one of the most common assays used. An immunofluorescent assay, put it in the plate reader and comes out, you spit a result. But somehow there's still not a standardized way for this assay to be automated across different companies, because everyone does it slightly different. And you have different endpoints that you're looking for in each assay where it pertains to some specific disease or drug or whatever you're looking at for the purpose of the ELISA. So even a simple assay like that, it's like still very hard to automate, because there's so many different use cases you can use it for, right? So It's it's all about resources, and I think that companies should really prioritize the ones that give the biggest roadblock and focus the most time on that roadblock, even if it's going to take significant manpower to automate that. In the long term, it would be the most streamlined and efficient solution, I think, if you're looking into the long-term horizon, rather than just automating a quick, easy, short task that, is still very manual, but it's really easy to do, and automating it could be very fast. But you could just, when you code and you run into random hiccups and errors like all the time. So random hiccups could take, a full day or like a week that you just didn't expect. So I'd rather focus on the ones that are the biggest roadblocks and put your resources towards that.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Do you suspect your life sciences company could do things more efficiently? Maybe you're seeing costly workflow issues, or maybe the work feels more difficult to perform than necessary, affecting team morale. If any of this resonates, reach out to the team at Sigma Lab Consulting for a free consultation on how we can develop and launch a custom solution fit for your team. Our consultants will build a custom workflow solution for your team to reach peak efficiency. Find out more at www.sigmalabconsulting.com. So you actually kind of started to hint on something that I wanted you to hopefully provide for our listeners. If they have the opportunity, how can someone that's working in the lab identify really the processes that should be automated in their own workflow? So let's say that they don't have these giant workflows. These are more of just kind of day-to-day tasks. So how can someone identify this is something that I should be able to automate?
The easiest thing for me to keep an eye on is like, how much copying and pasting am I doing from the lab?
Isn't it crazy how the Control V, Control C is strong in 2023?
It's still, yeah. So the more you copy and paste between this and that, the more this could be something that's automated. I think that's like the easiest thing to think about. And then I think another thing people in the wet lab should think about maybe is on the topic of like notebooks. We now have online notebooks that are gaining massive popularity, and actually even like large companies are adopting it because it's better documentation control of original data of where it comes in. And your personal notebook, it used to be a little bit reversed, where the most important data comes from the scientists in their personal notebook or whatnot. But now, when you first record data, there's this trend switching to recording it directly into the database, the raw data output, and then putting that into your notebook. But that's like that could be a whole nother topic where, you still have to repeat your data twice. And there's actually arguments for keeping the still manual process alive, because it adds a layer of auditing between the person running the assay and having them take a second look at what they're putting down into their physical notebooks or their own personal notes in terms of putting that there. But yeah.
I gotta say, I'm actually a fan of that myself. I automate a lot in the processes that I manage. At the same time, there are certain things that I maintain to be automated maintain to be manual, because it's sort of like taking notes in a classroom. Some people just say, hey, we have the PowerPoints. I don't have to do anything. I can just look at the PowerPoints. But for me, as I'm writing through it, as I'm manually recording something, it's given me additional grasp on the material. So in the same light, if I have some level of manual input from my process, I have almost a deeper knowledge as to what happened and what the resulting data shows. So, Dan, can you talk just briefly about the type of impact that workflows that automations has in workflow resources? So, when we think about a workflow, oftentimes we're not really thinking about how much FTE, how much consumables. We're usually thinking about how much time does this workflow take.
Yep.
We're going to have an input. How much time until I get my output? But what is the impact of automations uh, on these workflows? What do you see it not just from a purely timing point, but on people, on the morale, on their feeling for doing these experiments that may have some mundane segments of it?
I mean, I think some people like it because it's somewhat therapeutic. And then there are other people who become a little bit lost, like me, and then they get siloed into the specialty, and it kind of cuts away at whatever else they could be doing to enhance their development. So for me personally, when I would be stuck in this route of running these screening assays that I developed, so like it was a success on my part, but the success also came with now like, okay, now you're also the maintainer, right? So now that I have to, and once you kind of get really good at something, then you're also siloed into that specific thing that you're good at, and you can't really develop beyond that. And I think I was lucky enough that I was able to build multiple different standard assays at my company, and and then I was managing, multiple different assays that I had to repeat. But the thing that annoyed me the most is that as I took on more and more work, the same manual processes that slowed me down as soon as I finished an experiment would always be there regardless. So despite how different an experiment would run or whatever, the analysis part between the copying, pasting, the PowerPoint making, the graph making, that was kind of all the same. And it limits my freedom to potentially go on to like another project. And if I want to do something else, or if I wanted to start to transition onto the informatics side, and I had a couple of projects that I was potentially going to have time and go on, but my work became so busy with my main projects that I didn't have time to go and venture out and do other things because I just got really good at what I developed already. So for me, it was like, if I like could only automate this analysis, then I could have time and do what I really want to do, or do something that's more impactful, or start looking up more things. And then oftentimes, companies, like if I got to this point, I would get a promotion or whatever, and then, or I'm starting to get overworked and I want to transition to something out, then they'll potentially just hire someone else and then I can train them on it. However, there could just be a delay where they just like, okay, well, Dan was supposed to go on to this informatics project, but he's still so busy. So we're just going to hire someone directly for the informatics project that we had there, and then they have experience. So then I lose out on the experiences that I could get from a different side of the industry. And that's kind of what pushed me a little bit over the edge, to just go and do it on my own.
I mean, you're describing, you're describing a lack of time.
Yeah.
And I think that almost every, and especially in the Boston area, probably every scientist will tell you, yeah, I usually don't have enough time in the day. And, to your point, these are the kind of things that really pushed myself to try to automate my workflows, because there've been two roles that I had taken in the past where I was the only person in my position, and in managing, 5, 6, 7, 8 projects, you better learn to automate something, because you're going to drive yourself crazy. And that's, I think that's exactly what you're describing, is to, give yourself that time back. You want to be able to have some time to not just spend on doing the experiment and just spitting out the data, but processing it mentally. What does it even mean? What does this even mean?
There was so many times where we're trying to, when you're at the difference between, I guess, a startup and a really big company is that a big company, you already know your money is still going to come in. like the Pfizers of the world, the Roches. They know they already have a product on market. At a startup, the more you produce, the better you make your company look, and the more the company can they're on a chase. They're chasing after, either an acquisition, going public, or putting a drug to market, right? So the more work you do, the better it looks for the company. But once you reach a critical mass of you already have a product on your market, what you do, it kind of slows you down. And what happened with me is that because we were trying to produce so much and we wanted to screen so many drugs, I was just constantly doing the assay, running it, and analyzing it, and then submitting it away. But I didn't really have time to look at it and process it. And that's what I enjoy doing. That's what most scientists really enjoy doing. So by automating your analyses and automating whatever task it is that you can see mundane, so you have more time to reflect, you can read more research papers on the topic, or you can look out, you have more time to do introspective thinking work that you wouldn't have had before with this automation workflow, just automating all your workflows. That's like super, super important.
Absolutely. Dan, we have enjoyed this conversation, and I really hope that folks are really grabbing something from this, that you don't always have to wait for some big initiative to take place in order for you to think about how you would automate your space. Take a look at what you're doing. Take a look at what some of these rote work has turned into, and find a way to give yourself back time to analyze the data, to understand the data, to even improve yourself by taking on a different task, because now that you have the time for it. So we definitely appreciate you coming by and having a chat with us. How can our listeners communicate with you if they want to learn a little bit more about what you do and what you offer, and also maybe they may have some questions on how they can start automating on their own process?
Yeah, so I think the best way to reach me is probably on LinkedIn. I don't really use Twitter. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I think if you just put Dan, D-L-U-U on LinkedIn, I'll probably show up. And they can read my article on when should you start automating, or signs you should start automating your standard assays. And I'll be writing a couple more articles for my consulting firm about, just automation practices and things that are slowing down in the life sciences, and how we can improve them. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be here and talking to both of you.
Yeah. Appreciate it, Dan. We'll definitely make sure to have that information in the show notes so that folks can get in contact with you and take a look at the assay. I read the assay, and it's a great assay. I read the article, and it's a great article. So I may have you start to write ours as well.
Thank you, Dan.
I had an editor. Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and if you're interested in being a guest on our show, send us a message at leanbydesign@sigmalabconsulting.com. You've been listening to the Lean by Design podcast. Music is by Alex Grohl and Anton Vlasov of Pixabay. The show is produced by Michelle Gonzalez and hosted by Oscar Gonzalez and Lawrence Wong of Sigma Lab Consulting. Until next time, work smarter before you work harder.